Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Catherine Cole, and I'm the coordinator of the UNESCO chair at York University in Toronto, Canada, as well as a proud PhD student at International Islamic University in Malaysia. I'm delighted to moderate this panel today. A few housekeeping notes to begin with. The panel is planned for roughly 60 minutes, and we invite our audience to leave comments and questions in the chat at any time. Please be so kind and remain muted if you're not speaking, while we're actually grateful for everyone who's comfortable to share their cameras so we can better connect with the audience. As I'm joining today from the traditional territories of the indigenous peoples of the Orang Asli in the Greater Gombak area in Kuala Lumpur, I invite everyone to consider your location and recognize the traditional lands that you might be on and acknowledge its caretakers. Today's Democracy, Global Citizenship, and Transformative Education Symposium 2023 aims to discuss peace, culture, and social justice as cross-cutting foundations of just and equitable futures. And this session, All Relations, Decolonizing Environmental Education for Greater Impacts on Societies, will address perspectives on the relevance and importance of indigenous and traditional knowledge and discuss ideas on decolonizing education. While I acknowledge that all speakers are non-indigenous, they are advocates for indigenous perspectives in mainstream education. I am joined by three very distinguished speakers from Canada and Malaysia today. First, Professor Liette Vasseur, UNESCO Chair in Community Sustainability at Brock University in Canada, with a strong track record in researching and working on community sustainability and ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change, often collaborating with rural communities. From 2018 to 22, Liette also served as the president of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. And secondly, my own rector, Professor Tanzrizul Razak, the current rector of the International Islamic University in Malaysia. Before that, he served as a vice chancellor of University Science Malaysia and president of the International Association of University. Zul follows a strong vision of service for higher education, serving communities and creating knowledge and research that will support humans thriving individually and collectively in balance. And last but not least, Professor Charles Hopkins, UNESCO chairholder of the UNESCO Chair in Reorienting Education Towards Sustainability at York University, Canada, who has been involved with education for sustainable development since the early beginnings and promotes the role of education as a key enabler of a sustainable future. He also coordinates the global research network Indigenous ESD. Now, let's start the conversation. Over a long time, indigenous knowledge has been marginalized and when taken, often done in inappropriate ways. At the same time, indigenous and traditional knowledge, perspectives, and worldviews might be key to solving the current sustainability crisis. As I'm inviting all speakers now for their initial input, I would like to ask them to frame their response on how to decolonize education in responding to the three questions that are posed by the UNESCO report on the futures of education, reimagining a new social contract for education. What should we be and continue to be doing? What should be abandoned? And what needs to be creatively invented afresh? Let me start with Liette. Let me invite you to start with three questions, and I'm looking forward to your input.
Good. Well, thank you very much. And first, if I look at what I'm doing is I'm currently speaking from Victoria, British Columbia, and Canada on the traditional territories of the Inuit peoples. However, I live usually in St. Catharines in Ontario, Canada, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. To go back to your questions, for the first one, what should we continue doing? I feel that in Canada, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the call for action that were deposited in 2015, a major step was made to acknowledge the wrongdoing of the past and even the present, and the injustice done to Indigenous people. And now we are trying to reconcile. But I would say it's not completely true. We still have a lot to do. The process has been taken seriously by several organizations, but remains to be done in education at all levels. We need to continue educating about the past with the right information. And this is probably one of the big challenges. There are still many biases and misinformation even today, and this is true even in higher education. We still have a long way to go to have all the curricula change to bring the truth to all generations. As the elders always mention, we cannot walk the reconciliation if first we don't acknowledge the truth. So that's, I think, the first thing that we need still to continue to work on the truth first. New action has been initiated to increase first awareness of the injustice that was done, and sometimes are still done to Indigenous people. We need to continue supporting these efforts. That should be more systemic in our university. It seems often that we hear only about Indigenous people and the truth and reconciliation when we have special events or on specific celebration days, like in September, for example, or in June. But this is not enough. The second action is that we have to create an ethical space where knowledge sharing becomes important to enhance respects and exchange of ideas for sustainable development. And this is especially true in universities. We really have to start working a lot further on that. There's a lot to learn from Indigenous people. In terms of your question, what needs to be abandoned is the notion that they are vulnerable and that their way of knowledge is not useful and appropriate for matching with the Western science. That remains a big, big, big challenge, especially for me being in biology, in the faculty of math and science. I see that on a regular basis. I hear very often in the biological sciences department, where most are in molecular or developmental biology, that they don't see the space or the place of Indigenous knowledge in these disciplines. There are preconceptions that needs to be openly discussed and to start to better build a more constructive dialogue on how to decolonize sciences and bring the concept of two-eye seeing. It's true that being an ecologist and working with First Nations for several years, I've adopted this approach, and we are now merging both ways of knowing in some research and activities that we are doing at the community level. As well as my own courses, I teach ecosystem ecology, and there are, in fact, lectures on it. There are activities that we do that show that we can decolonize our system of education. It's just a question that, yeah, we need to work at it. It's not something that is completely free, and you need to do it with high respect and with their help, because we don't know everything. So that's one thing. In terms of the needs to be creatively invented fresh, I will say the complete way as to how we educate youth and deliver knowledge probably needs to be reinvented in some way. There's a teacher in the Bruce Peninsula who is now on the board, by the way, of the UNESCO Niagara Escarpment Biosphere Network, who has moved his class in the woods, literally. It's called the Blue Mountain Wild School, where youth are immersed in experiences that evoke curiosity, challenge, and passion for learning and discovery, and foster lifelong love for learning and the natural world. But because he works with First Nation across Canada for many, many years, he has been able to embrace the two-eye seeing in the activities of the school, and is in fact supported by some of them. It demonstrates that we can be creative in changing the way that we educate. And this is will have a big, huge impact on the future of education for sustainable development. In fact, I often talk that going beyond sustainability, we need a radical transformation. And this can only happen through systems thinking. To get there, all of the education system must be recreated through the system set thinking approach to reduce silos and constrained thinking that we have currently because of compartmented discipline and departments. So I think I will leave it at this level for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liat. It's a nice entrance coming from the truth and reconciliation efforts that are very specific for Canada, moving into a more structural involvement, looking into science and towards transforming entire education systems. So I would now like to invite Zul to bring a Malaysian perspective to the discussion, following the questions: what should we continue to be doing? What should be abandoned? And what needs to be invented creatively and fresh?
Thank you very much, Catherine. Hi, Liat and Charles. Nice to be here. I come from a developing country. Perhaps my take is probably different from what we have listened normally. So in Malaysia in particular, I think the question of education is an important question. But what does it serve us is a question that I think we're beginning to ask, particularly after the pandemic. I thought what we should continue is to regard education as a kind of a source of information to find out what is the meaning of life. In other words, there is a purpose to life, and therefore what is it that we need to educate ourselves to arrive at this meaning and to deliver that particular purpose. Yeah? From the holistic, from the indigenous point of view, the cultural point of view, we think it is about a holistic education. In other words, getting in touch with the whole person, the entire person. What in our case here we call humanizing education. How do we become a better human being first before we try to address the market or job or whatever it is, to learn to understand what it is all about. So in essence, I think it is about the whole idea of knowing thyself, knowing who you are, and trying to address your position in the whole spectrum of what life is all about. So that, I think, should continue to be the major sort of message for education. Although we understand that this is now being distorted in many ways. So unless and until we get that right, we are not able to connect with one another, because at the end of the day, the humanity, the human values is the one that connects us, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of cultural value. That common basis of being human, I think, is something that we want to cherish. And when we go to the indigenous population, this seems to be their sort of foundation, yeah, of what education is all about. So I think that would be one area that I think we should continue, not only to make it as the way it is, but to continue to enhance it. To continue to enhance it, in my sense, means that we need now to compete with the new ideas of what education is all about. In our case, it is education has been targeted at the market, to be honest. I think it is about livelihood. All of us go to school, all of us go to university and obtain a degree because all of us want to be successful in that particular economic sense. So earning money and making our livelihood better it has become the focus of what education is about in Malaysia. Suddenly, when the pandemic comes, we find that livelihood is no longer important. We find suddenly life is more important than livelihood. You may have a lot of money, you may live well, but suddenly you find there's no mobility, nothing to buy, and your money becomes useless, And then we begin to experience the other part of life and how to organize life itself. So this focus now suddenly we find that we do not know how to organize life. There's very little resiliency, very little way to cope, because this is a part that we have never sort of attempt to. If you go back to the UNESCO 4 pillars of learning, I think we are good in learning to do and learning to know, but we are not good in learning to be and learning to live together. So that I think this is the part that I think we need to focus on when I talk about enhancing education, and to make sure that education is in a balance. And that indeed is what indigenous education is all about. Indigenous education is about learning how to stay in a balance within yourself, and also to balance within your environment. This whole question of balance and harmony is a lesson that we all need to learn. How do you arrive at a balance, and how could you live in a harmonious situation, not only among yourself, but also among all the other creations that you know, the non-human life, the trees and the vegetation or whatever it is. All these, I think, are part and parcel of that new education that we think it is important. Some people will frame it now as planetary sort of education, yeah. But all along, I think it is about us and the whole planet, that we are one and not separated. So in other words, we are responsible for our own living space, and to ensure that at the end of the day, whatever we took from this living space should be returned to the future generation in a better condition, if not in what it is. So that kind of a mission, I think, is something that we need to make into focus. You want to call it sustainable development, but I've got a problem with the definition of sustainable development, in the sense that it doesn't take into account what the past is all about. We talk about sustainable development, the present and the future, but we seldom talk about the past. In indigenous knowledge, the past is important. The past is the one that sort of decides what the future would be, in a kind of a continuum. So it cannot be, quote unquote, segmented. Where is the future and where is the past? Indeed, in many cases, the future will be, the past will be a reference for us. The whole idea that the only constant is change, to us does not work, because there must be a reference point. And that reference point is often the past. What works in the past may be something that we can learn from moving into the future. So I'll stop at that, Catherine, and hope we can have some discussion on this.
Thank you very much, Zul. So, and I see a certain alignment here already with recognizing the value of education, and realizing the whole person. And so I'm inviting Charles now. Again, the three questions: what should we continue, what should be abandoned, and what needs to be reinvented afresh?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Catherine. Hi, Liat. Hi, Zul. It's nice to join. What do we continue doing? Well, you know, we're not doing nearly enough, but at any rate, I think I really agree with Liat on acknowledging our past, owning up to it, the impact that previous generations. I can remember growing up in a community that was surrounded by indigenous people, and the way they were treated has never left me. And you know, I have a sort of a very guilty conscience of what the people in our town really did. And I think the other point, though, just acknowledging it is not enough. We have to really seek and continue. We're trying to find ways to mitigate the damage. But we need to do it a lot more. We need to build on the truth and reconciliation progress, and we can't let that slip away. We have to keep it relevant. Keep it current. The progress that we're making in trying to train teachers and build realistic knowledge of indigenous people, the conditions that they're living in now, many in a third world condition, rather than the way they used to be, the stereotype of the Inuit, and our other First Nations. I think we could continue trying to share the whole truth and reconciliation process, perhaps with other countries, and help our indigenous people work with other indigenous people internationally. That's just starting, but I think we need to continue doing it. And the other thing that I think was a real breakthrough, Canada is growing very rapidly with our immigration. And so the idea of adding to our citizenship oath, the adding that new citizens also take the oath to uphold the treaties. We're all treaty people in Canada. And it's very difficult for new Canadians who have no idea of what has been the past, how at times, for a long time, we were three nations, not just English and French, but First Nation as well. And so I think those are some of the things we need to do. The abandoning, that was the second one, wasn't it, Catherine? What do we need to abandon? Well, I think that we need to really stop the cultural annihilation. That it is still going on. We have a colonization, we need to help them mentality. And yes, we do, but how we go about it, what is our attitude? We need to figure that out. Some of it is overt, much is unintentional, but a great deal of it is just not paying any attention to it at all. Just letting it slide by. So the whole thing about we have to stop that, the hurt and what is continuing. I think we have to stop stealing their wisdom without proprietary rights and any kind of recompense. We have a long history of taking their knowledge of healing power of plants. There are many stories of how we have taken their traditional knowledge and it turned it into medicine to be sold back to the indigenous people, even making it illegal for them to practice their own medicines. And so on. So I think what we have to do is really acknowledge the wisdom, but somehow, if we go to the third question, what needs to be done, I think we have to come up with new equitable ways of meaningfully entering into discussions to co-generate new wisdom around sustainable, building a sustainable future. We have to acknowledge that the insight and the basic premise of sustainable development is embedded in indigenous wisdom all around the world. It has been. They must finally say, well, when you come up in 1987, thank you, Roharlan Brundtland, and you've come up with the concept of sustainable development, it's been embedded in indigenous cultures for centuries, for thousands of years. And so the idea of trying to understand, for instance, the wisdom of the 7 generations and so on, how do we enter into a discussion to learn our way forward? It has to be some kind of integration, respectful, knowledgeable integration, because we're all on planet Earth. We're all in the same boat. And the wisdom and the guiding principles of the indigenous people worked in the past, but we have changed and altered the world with technology and population size and so on. We can't suddenly move the tribe to another area and let the land regenerate. I mean, these things just, with 8 billion people on the planet, we can't be shifting. Many of us, it's estimated that close to 1 billion by 2050 will have been shifted, but that's due to climate change, not to foresight and to plan into the future. So the idea of listening to basic philosophical worldviews and respectfully discussing this is something that really needs to be done. I'm not sure how to do it. I'm not sure if Indigenous people will even share it. We will have to find that out. I think what also needs to be done is research into improving the education of everyone, including Indigenous peoples. They are least well served by the world's education systems. So that is something that really, really needs to be done, the overlap. And as I say, how can we capture the worldview, the insight, and so on, with appropriate non-colonial methods? I think those are some of the things, at any rate, that I think should be done, should be abandoned, and what we can build on. I love that traffic light kind of thing. The red, what do we stop? The orange, sort of continue with caution, and the green, what do we start going? But anyway, thanks. I'll leave it at that point.
Thank you. Well, I'm hearing a lot of commonalities. There's a recognition of past and history, understanding the value of knowledge, treating it equal to the so-called Western knowledge, holistic approaches to education, systems thinking in networks, also looking at teacher training and creating a dialogue. But often, I mean, those principles sound wonderful, but often we need to bring it down to what does this mean on Tuesday at 11, and what do we do from here? So I'm turning into a round of follow-up question, and I'm wondering, Liet, you talked about bringing science out of the classroom, but how do you really bring out education out of the classroom to create that societal impact that we all hope for?
Yeah, as I mentioned, but there's the Blue Mountain Wild School. This is only one. There are a few more that are trying, but it's sometimes complicated, I have to admit. In universities, we have to start finding ways to get students out of the classroom. And I don't mean only going to the woods. It's not just that. Most students in higher education are not connected to the real world in a positive way. You know, when you say that in Canada, for example, 31% of our students in universities are suffering of mental health, it demonstrates that there's something behind that. And so the problem is they learn a lot from the social media about climate change in terms of disaster, that nothing happens, crimes and wars, as well as social justice. But the media only love to talk about what is dramatic and sensational. They don't bring necessarily solution. And this is where I think we're missing. When we educate, we tend to do that. We're dramatic because the students like it in some way. But we have to start looking at solution. And this is where decolonizing the system can help a lot, because we need to really start looking at it in another way. And we need to have more internship, experiential learning, and possibilities for students to go in the real world, but with solution. And these solutions cannot be just, talking about the way that our classroom are also built doesn't help, I should say. The students are kept in silos. They don't see how they can help because they only look at one discipline in terms of solution. When you talk to Indigenous people, and I really love when Zol mentioned the word holistic. It's really important. It's a holistic approach that needs to be put together, and the balance of learning to become human. Interestingly enough, Indigenous people often talk about this. This is why they are going back with their children in outdoors and other places to give them back their traditional knowledge, because they know that, and this is why I always say, they are probably less vulnerable than people are thinking, because they know how to live and be grateful for all things in life. So this is why, if you look at the acknowledgement, a full acknowledgement can take a day, because they will be grateful for every single part of our life. And we tend to forget that. We assume, in our case, we're entitled to what we have. And this is a big challenge that we have to deal. So for greater impact is really to first have, from the little kid in school, to be grateful to what they have. If they don't even have that, how do you want to bring them to understand the beauty of a flower, to understand why, for Indigenous people, traditional hunting is still very important, but they use everything. It's not just for exploitation. I think the Western world is really in terms of exploitation of resources versus of the respect of the resources for life, which is completely different. It's interesting because we are working right now on, we talk often about ecosystem services, and gradually the Intergovernmental Panel on Policy on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBBS, I've talked about more nature's contribution to people. Working with Indigenous people, we're talking about nature's contribution to life, because it's for everyone. Water is important not only for human, it's important for all species, and it's the same for anything. So I think we have to really bring these aspects to children from the very early age, but keep it on for all life. The biggest problem, and we discussed that in my course in ecosystem ecology, and one with a combined education and biology major, she was saying, we learn at an early age. Then when we get to high school, everything is forgotten because we're in silos in disciplines and we forget about it. So when we become adult, it's all forgotten again. So we don't have a continuous link of what life is important. And I think this is why, the issue of money is more important than life. It's getting that way. And this is very dangerous right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. The whole discussion on is education to become a good employer or to be employee or entrepreneur or to become a good human being is certainly one that is at least now taking place. There is this discussion, and I'm sure in many countries these days the mental health issues, especially after the pandemic, are a huge issue. The worries of the young generation generation about their futures being exposed to all of the trauma that is going on every day. And I'm moving on over to Zul, because I also know experiential education, as Liat explains, just explained it and advocated for it, as something that is very prominent here at the university in International Islamic. And the approach here to decolonize is under the term humanizing education and humanizing the ecosystem. If you could explore that with us and explain a little bit more, I would be grateful. Thank you.
Okay, let me start by reciting one of my experience when we adopted a school. This is a school for the indigenous people. And when we adopted the school, there was 80% absenteeism. Nobody wants to go to the school. And we found out later on, they do not come to the school because they are not allowed to climb trees in the school. In their indigenous practice, climbing trees is part of a pastime, and they spend their time in the trees and chatting with one another. So we somehow rather work with the authorities, and out of the 10 trees, there are 7 trees that they could climb. The other trees probably too dangerous for them to do it. And we announced it to them, you can come to the school now and climb trees, and suddenly within a month, we got all the 80% back. They come to school very early. If the school starts at 8, they're already there at 7, and they climb the trees. And they enjoy themselves. When the bell rings, and they come to the classroom, and then they attend to this class. Earlier, when they are not allowed to climb trees, they have to sit in the classroom, which is artificial for them, to listen to one guy speaking up front. And they cannot tolerate that. So we break this up, and they become part and parcel of the ecosystem, as it were. And the school runs very well, so much so that they do not want to go back to their house when the school is over. So when the school is over at 2 o'clock, they still hang around about 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and their parents now are getting worried. The children doesn't want to go to school at one point. Now they don't want to come back. So they come to the school and they start to investigate, and they found what the school is all about. And eventually, to cut the story short, they own the schools. The parent comes and decorate the schools and make the school clean, and they somehow or rather find that this is an opportunity where the indigenous part and the modern part could be integrated together. The lesson that I learned from that is basically, like you say, Liet, we need to respect what they are used to as part of their learning. There's many ways of learning. And I think the classroom is one way of learning which is alien to them. And I think which is alien to most of us. When I was a kid, the classroom is not a big deal. What is a big deal is outside the classroom, where we learn each other in our own way. You may want to call it cooperative learning or whatever it is, where we devise our own learning sort of methods and support one another, unlike the classroom. The classroom, you're almost siloed, individualized. You are not allowed to speak with one another. Sometimes you're regimented in a particular sense. So I'm beginning to feel that the classroom is not a good invention, as it were. I think if I go a little bit more, it is an outcome of the Industrial Revolution, if you want. The way we are organized, the way we are put to sit is almost like a factory. In roles of that nature, and listening to a supervisor, which happens to be the teacher, and we work at bell rings. The bell rings this, you move that, you bell rings that, you move this. So I think we need to move away from this whole idea of a classroom per se, and start to integrate with what, and this is what I think when Catherine asked, humanizing university is what we are doing at the moment in time. We're telling our students that all of them must work with the community, and to make them work with the community, they must identify a problem in the community. And they must go back to the community, and we learn them how to do community profiling. We teach them how to do community profiling. What is it to look for? How to find a solution in the first semester. And then they will submit this as a kind of project. They will look into what is workable, what is not workable. Once that is done, on the second semester, they will start to implement it. So the classroom is the place for the operationalize the thing, and the implementation is really in the community itself. And last year, we've got more than 250 projects that the students presented to us as what they have done, in a way trying to understand, and some of them are able to even solve the problem of the community. Now, we call the people who are interested in this, whatever agency, including the industry, and some of them picked up this project and they own this project now. And this project become, quote unquote, one of the flagship of the university. So that becomes a learning module at the end of the day, how to actually solve a problem in the real world, in the real situation as well. So in this particular context, Catherine, I think the context is important. What I find now in this modern education, the context is not important at all. What you teach in the UK, you then try to superimpose it in Malaysia. To start off with, the climate is not the same. You know, this is already telling us that, you know, we are not giving the right message to the people on the ground, that everything needs to be imported. Sustainable development, for example, needs to be imported from a Western-centric point of view, whereas, like Chuck said, we have got our own understanding of what sustainable development is all about. And that, I think, needs to be integrated. So we are now finding words that actually mirrors what has been organically practiced in the past. We are going back to the past. For in our case, the word sejahtera is a word that we are now trying to develop and operationalize, so that when people mention this word, they automatically think about sustainable development, not in the translated form, but in the real organic form, with the values and the culture embedded with it, that becomes part and parcel of the way of living in this particular part of the world. It's a long way to go, but I think we have found out some very critical solution, that the students come back to us and say 3 weeks in the community is better than 3 years in the university. There's no textbook that we can rely on. We rely on ourselves. We learn from the elders. We learn their wisdom as well. In classrooms, often there's no wisdom. It's only knowledge. Yeah, and we learn how to build relationship. I think that's a big one for me. How to build relationship and respect these people outside, the indigenous people that we often think that, quote unquote, they're uncivilized. They'll have a lot more wisdom than us. I'll give you one example. If they can cook rice, you eat rice as staple yet, I think you know. They can cook rice and the rice remains for 3 days and 3 nights without being spoiled. In our case, when we build rice, the remains needs to go to the refrigeration, otherwise it gets spoiled. For them, they can remain outside. They have no refrigeration anyway. And how do they do this? And that's the wisdom that we are trying to learn from them. And it is very sustainable. You don't have to buy a fridge. You don't have to switch on the electricity, but you can still maintain the food in the long term, the way they have practiced it. So these are the wisdom that the students are very, very excited about. And they're asking us, why are we not learning this? And we are now trying to transit many of this into the mainstream idea as far as university is concerned. I don't know whether I'm answering your question, Catherine, but that's the experience that we've got so far.
No, that's great. And I mean, looking back at my own education, I think everyone feels like that the textbook cover is not quite ingrained in your memories, but it's more the experience that you had when you got your hands dirty and you were actually involved somewhere. Yeah,
exactly.
Thank you. Yeah, nice. And a good story, tree climbing, which sounds so simple, but is so important. And it is no one's place to look down on it, and it has to be treated with the respect that it deserves. Chuck, anything to add? Because you're also talking about learning from and with Indigenous. Would you like to add to the discussion?
Yeah, just building on what Zul was saying, there's a great saying about that. There's a big difference between the map and the actual landscape when you get out there. You're not going to really prepare it that way. Yeah, in educating for a sustainable future, we've identified sort of four big areas. The first one being to raise the overall education level, access and retention in quality education. Right now, there are about 250 million children not in school, and another 750 million who are in school. These are UNESCO figures who have been there 5 or 6 years, still can't read or write. There's only about 10% of the world's population that is actually online with good connection and so on, students, that is. So it is a huge task to try and educate for it. But at the same time, we realize it's our most educated countries that are leaving some of the greatest and deepest ecological footprints. And so doing more of what we have been doing in the developed countries and doing it better all over the world is not necessarily the only answer. You know, in fact, anyone with sort of a rational brain would say, ooh, there is a problem there. So there is a call now for transforming education. Transforming to address equity, transforming to address the quality of education, and transforming to address the relevance of education. Now, we can do that, but if I go back to the very beginning in 1992, when we first started looking towards education for sustainable development, we said, look, this is so complex. Disciplines working on their own can't do it, even multidisciplinary approaches so that our current disciplines get better from learning from one another. We said it has to be transdisciplinary. And transdisciplinary means that you not only do interdisciplinary, but you involve the academic disciplines with the community, with reality, right? And I strongly suggest that we need to include indigenous wisdom, technical, traditional ecological knowledge, whether it's from indigenous or there are some very traditional communities around the world that where they have made things work for 1,000 years. And they really need to be part of the conversation as equal partners, listening, sharing. And we need to open our worldview and our minds, because we need to create new knowledge. Just applying our current knowledge better is not going to do it. It's a huge thing. And it's not only the knowledge. I think we have a lot to learn in how we deliver it to make a difference. We all know things we shouldn't do, from the knowledge, but we do it anyway.
Anyway.
We can be told all kinds of things. You shouldn't do this, yeah, but it's no effect. And I am become more and more fascinated with how indigenous people pass on the knowledge through storytelling. And I want to tell a quick one right now. In the highlands of Taiwan, I visited an indigenous school. And as I went through the big gates, on one side was a giant toad model out of concrete, a big black toad. And on the other side was a big black bird mounted up on a post. And I went in and I spent several hours looking around the school, seeing what they did and so on. But I asked the principal, I said, what about the bird and the toad? And he said, I have a little girl who can speak some English. I'll have her tell you. And so we went out and we're standing at the gate with this little girl. And she said, You know, when humans first came to the world, they really didn't have any talent, or they weren't very good at anything. And the animals thought that they should help them. And so they thought the best thing would be the gift of fire. And so a frog knew where the volcano was. And the frog went to the volcano and put a bit of lava on its back. It burnt its back with the warts and so on. It made it very blacky gray, but the toad brought the fire back. And humans learned how to cook and how to preserve food, how to stay warm and so on. And I said about the bird, I said, well, the bird went along too. It was the most beautiful bird of all the birds. And it took the lava and put it on its beak. It burnt its feathers. The beak went all black, but the bird came back and sacrificed itself to bring fire. And I said, well, that's quite a story. And she said, it's not a story. This is to guide us. She said, it didn't quite use the word in grade 4, but she was telling, she said, the story really is that it's the plants and the animals that have saved us. They looked after us. And today we don't look after them. And if we don't, we could be in real trouble. We have to share. Now, the thing is, I remember that story. I don't remember much else from a half a day of visit and talking to the principal was nice, and the teachers were okay, and they had some strange musical instruments that they all played. But I remember that story, and I think that storytelling, the complexity of the story, because most of us, when we read Indigenous stories in books and so on, we think, oh, that's pretty weird. You know? But no more weird than a talking snake in the Garden of Eden. I mean, let's be real. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, so the idea of connecting our emotions, becoming transdisciplinary. Again, you keep coming back. Are you coming back to the equality of knowledge, and also looking into the purpose of education? So I'm asking a broader question, as you're all in higher education, and I consider all of you leaders in higher education. One thing is working with the students, but higher education is much more, with our broad mandate of teaching, research, and most of our community service. So if we want to decolonize education and engage with knowledge systems and indigenous peoples, what are our responsibilities? What are our roles now and into the future? And if you don't mind, I'm going to start with Liat again. And you're welcome to tell any story you wish.
Well, yeah, I would say the higher education, first of all. And I know that some universities have tried and it didn't necessarily work. And I think the problem in all that is that there's this push, the famous push of publish or perish and all these things. So it means that to be able to really be innovative in higher education, we're having a hard time. And if I look at math and science, we're the worst in terms of decolonizing. We are having a hard time in terms of figuring out how to do it, but also the perception that traditional knowledge sounds almost boring. Therefore, it's not new, it's not innovative. In science, you always try to have new technology, new this, new that. And they feel that automatically that would not be, would not be necessarily useful. The main problem comes also from the funding agencies and the way that the research is done, the funding. It's always, trying to be more innovative again. So to be able to bring that to higher education, I think we it's a radical change that we badly need. And you know, looking at all that, transforming education, I completely agree. The question of equity, I'm chair of the what we call in our case ID, so inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility committee for the Faculty of Math and Science, and we struggle because a lot of people either assume everything is resolved, or they don't want to talk about it. And it's the same for decolonizing. There's a real people are uncomfortable with that. And that is also the big problem. And it starts from the basis that most people don't know what is indigenous knowledge. They don't know what it means because they have no experience with it. And I've talked to even a colleague of mine who is in philosophy, and she's highly uncomfortable. We have a project called Beyond Sustainability, Radical Transformation through Systems Thinking, where we have indigenous people. And several of my Western colleagues had a hard time when the indigenous people are speaking, because it takes more time. People are not used to take time. Everything has to be published and perished, so they have to go fast, fast, fast. You have to do it now. And this is not the way. And so the idea of transdisciplinary research, for example, or education is complicated because we're trying to have shorter time for students in school to push them towards employee, as you mentioned, and not necessarily having this broad knowledge of life. And this remains a big issue. And we see that more and more in universities. And the interesting part, I was just talking just last week with one of my students who graduated from my lab and now is moving. Well, she has an employment. She wants to finally do a master. And but she did a lot of volunteering this summer. And she said, you know what? If I never had done this volunteering component, I wouldn't have known what I really wanted. And I wouldn't have known what really the world outside the university are experiencing, you know. And we often think only about, I would put it, tools in universities. You know, and I really, really love the point of the knowledge in school versus wisdom is in the real life. I really love this thing because when you said that, Zul, I felt that this is the main challenge that we're dealing with. And for several years, I've been on the selection for one of the judge for the Prime Minister's Award in Education in the science sector. And many of the applications, they were talking about their tools, not necessarily about what they did with it, if they did activities outside. They were few at that point. And I'm pretty sure they were the one because they were not fancy. They were not high tech and all that. I'm pretty sure that most of them never won any prize. And we had a couple of indigenous applications. And because they were not the traditional Western format, I'm sure didn't get selected as well. So it shows that we have a lot to do to bring the two-icing, the ethical space, all these components into our system. And I should say that we have discussed that a lot in the project that I have currently. And we face barriers. We face a lot of barriers. We have to really have a new open discussion on that. We have avoided that, in fact. I think we avoid talking about it correctly.
Thank you, Liat. Zul, would you like to build on what
Yeah,
Liat said on the rules?
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a small comment. I think Chuck is familiar with our smart school. the Lip-Ed Smart School. I don't know whether you know, last year, 2022, 2 of those schools were recognized as the top 10 best school in the world in 2022. And this year, another 2 were recognized as best top 10 in the world. This is a school that you're talking about, Liat. I think an ordinary school, it's not the high flyer, but the kind of curriculum, pedagogy, the philosophy is really transdisciplinary, you know. And I thought that the government will be very happy to know at least now 4 of our schools in the last 2 years had made it to the top 10 in the world, but the government are not even bothered. Because we were marked on like PISA, you know, TIMSS and PISA, and they are still thinking that we must go into this PISA thing, top 30% or whatever. So their goal itself is already a different one. So if your goal is a different one, then to push the so-called traditional unsophisticated school becomes a difficult choice. It's same like university, you know. If you're talking about a ranking, for example, right? Unless you meet those numbers, you are not being considered as successful. So this whole idea that I'm thinking about, how do we define success at the end of the day? I think that goal must change, first of all. If you're talking about just publish or perish, we are now talking about do or die. You know, you've got this knowledge, if you don't apply it, you will die. Forget about publish or perish. So we need to have an alternative view of what success looks like and becomes comfortable with it, rather than this colonized idea of what success is all about. You know, we must be ranked here, it must be this and that and that. And most of these are basically, does not apply to us, because the contexts are very different. I've seen, for example, some of the questions that were forwarded to our students. They talk about revolving door, to calculate the angle of a revolving door. We have not seen a revolving door for our life. How on earth we are going to just understand that questions? So I think the whole question of context, the whole question of what success looks like is something that maybe we want to begin with. Maybe this is what now we are trying to reorganize what we call the communiversity, with very 5 different ideas of what university should look like. Very quickly, one is about transdisciplinary. We're going to ask how transdisciplinary is your university, all right? And on top of that, we're going to ask how community engaged is your university. You may be transdisciplinary, but if you are not engaging the community, then you are still missing out something, right? The third thing we're going to ask about responsible research. Responsible research means the research that you do must engage whoever is going to benefit from this. If it's a community, the community must be involved from day one, and they must be also the evaluator at the end of the day. They will say, I benefited from this. The fourth one is about sustainable entrepreneurship. In other words, if you go into a community, and then when you walked out, can the community be independent? In other words, they don't, you don't make them dependent on you. You know, sometimes we think we know a hell of a lot and we make them dependent on us. Can they be independent on their own? This is what we call sustainable entrepreneurship. And last but not least, is collaboration. How do you collaborate from individual to institution and even to region? So we are trying to now reshape this into what university is all about, and now working out the metrics of how the success look like when you use these 3 or 5 sort of criteria for the so-called new university. We may not even want to call it a university, because the moment you call it a university, it becomes an excess baggage. We are loaded with so many things. That's why the RCE is a better word than a university. You run away from the old, you know, the old cliche of what university should look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Zul. Any addition to that? Any further comment? And I just want to remind everyone we're running out of time, and I know that Liat is starting her day, so I'm asking you to make it short. And maybe you can, Charles, also add a thought on the lack of power of emotion of scientific knowledge.
The lack of emotion. Wow.
So roles and responsibilities, higher education, building on communiversity, and maybe that's a question from Valdemar Sousa. Maybe the scientific scientific knowledge lacks the power of emotion. And all of that in my usual in a minute. Yeah, patience doesn't apply to me.
Yeah, sure. Oh, okay. I would say that we do need the scientific knowledge desperately. I think we need information, we need facts, and so on. The second thing, though, we need critical thinking in order to move. Really check the facts. Are they true? How do they fit together, etc.? Does this really make sense? But beyond that, as we said earlier, the third thing that we desperately need is hands-on engagement wherever possible, because it's that mixture of knowledge and the thinking it through. How is it relevant? How does it fit with other knowledge I have? And then actual engagement to build the kind of empathy, the compassion. And then we need to have the skills, when we have this compassionate person who wants to get engaged, to move from just the knowledge to action, because it's action we need. We also need to have the skills of how do you engage? How do you actually bring about change? How do you bring others to the fore, and so on? So all of that has an emotional construct that largely is lacking in formal education today. That's what I feel anyway.
Yeah, and so compassion more than compassion much broader for everyone, not only for the people we know, but beyond that for those who we haven't met yet. Yeah, let me do one last round. 60 seconds for everyone, because I know we're running out of time. Please respond to the question that you wish I would have asked you, and leave me, each of you leave a few last words. But what do you wish I would have asked today, and respond to that question, and leave me your comments, please.
So this is a tough one.
Yeah, I would say probably for me, how do we ensure that Indigenous people are actively participating, respected, and that we really seriously consider how to work together, merging. By the way, a couple of words that I heard sometime: inclusion and integration. These are two words that they don't like, because they don't want to be included. They have been already trying to be integrated a lot, and they don't want to be included that way. They would like more to have more like a web of knowledge. They would like more to be, combining the knowledge at the same level than being integrated into. So that's something that we, even just our words, the way that we speak often needs to probably change.
Thank you. Zul, over to you.
I think the question that we should be asking is this at all possible? I mean, the kind of pressures that we've got. I thought the technology will solve our problem. Now it looks like the technology is going to complicate our problem even more, with the AI, with the ChatGPT. So in other words, as we move one steps, the kind of barrier that we're going to face is probably a lot more than that. I just read an article today that Sweden now is introducing textbooks and writing using pen and paper, and they will start only technology at the age of 6. See how they have gone back, and they say technology will not be useful on day one because you have not developed the human dimension of yourself. you suddenly become an automaton or digital native, as it were, and you lose your humanity. And once you lose your humanity, to get it back is going to be difficult. So unless that push is, is away, and then I think we probably will. There's no, it's non-starter for me.
Mhm.
It's a non-starter for me.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
And for me, Carter, I know you were in a hurry. So the question would have been, is there a bit of indigenous wisdom that you'll always remember? And the indigenous elder from Africa, who in summing up very nicely what is sustainable development, and he said, it's enough for all forever. Enough for all forever. And the for all, of course, you can have all kinds of discussions around what is enough, but for all, being an indigenous person, you realize he was not limiting it to humans, but all forms of life and the intergenerational. And that kind of for all, I think, is spilling over now as we're trying to redirect education from the individual becoming all they can be to the common good. There's a responsibility for all, and that's embedded in indigenous wisdom. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Liet Vasseur from Brock University, Canada, Zul Razak from IIUM Malaysia, and Charles Hopkins from York University, Canada. It was a pleasure talking to you. I could continue forever. And I wish you for now a happy Friday and a good night in here. And thank you those who've been watching in the Zoom call. And thank you for those who've been watching on Facebook and those who will be watching this in the future on YouTube. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you very
you,
much for this.
everybody.
Thanks, Catherine.
And
Thank
good
you.
night from my side.